Have you ever thought about why the most powerful empires in history didn't fall because of external enemies, but because they isolated themselves from the world? Have you ever noticed how the moment someone builds walls around themselves, whether physical or psychological, they don't become safer, they become more vulnerable? There's a paradox at the heart of human survival that most people completely misunderstand, and today we're going to explore one of the most counterintuitive truths about power, safety, and human interaction. This video will change how you see protection, how you understand vulnerability, and how you navigate the dangerous game of life. Because what I'm about to tell you goes against every instinct you have about safety and security, yet it's been proven true across thousands of years of human history. The truth is this: isolation doesn't protect you, it kills you. Building walls doesn't make you safer, it makes you blind. Withdrawing from the world doesn't preserve your power, it guarantees your destruction. This is Law 18 from the 48 Laws of Power. Do not build fortresses to protect yourself, isolation is dangerous. And before you dismiss this as abstract philosophy, understand that this principle is determining your fate right now, whether you realize it or not. It's why some people thrive while others stagnate. It's why some careers soar while others plateau. It's why some relationships deepen while others wither. It's why some leaders remain powerful while others are overthrown. But here's what makes this law truly dangerous and truly misunderstood. When we feel threatened, when we feel hurt, when we feel overwhelmed, our first instinct is to retreat. To build walls. To protect ourselves through isolation. It feels safe. It feels smart. It feels like self-preservation. But it's actually self-destruction. We're cutting ourselves off from the very information, connections, and opportunities we need to survive. We're making ourselves vulnerable in the name of protection. We're guaranteeing the outcome we're trying to avoid. And most people never realize this until it's too late. So let me ask you, are you building fortresses? Are you isolating yourself? Are you withdrawing from the world in the name of protection? Are you surrounding yourself only with people who agree with you? Are you avoiding situations that make you uncomfortable? Are you protecting yourself so thoroughly that you're actually destroying yourself? Because if you are, you're violating one of the fundamental laws of power and survival, and you will pay the price whether you understand it or not. Let's start with the most basic truth about survival: information is life. Every organism that has ever existed has survived or died based on the quality of information it could gather about its environment. The predator that can detect prey survives. The prey that can detect predators survives. The organism that can sense changes in temperature, food availability, threats, and opportunities survives. The organism that cannot sense these things dies. This is not philosophy. This is biology. Information flow equals survival. Isolation equals death. Now apply this to human beings and human societies. Throughout history, the civilizations that remained open to the world, that engaged in trade, that welcomed foreign ideas, that maintained diplomatic connections, those civilizations thrived. They had access to new technologies, new strategies, new resources, new allies. They knew what their enemies were planning. They understood changes in the world around them. They could adapt. Meanwhile, the civilizations that isolated themselves, that built walls, that cut themselves off from the world, those civilizations stagnated and eventually collapsed. They became blind to threats. They missed opportunities. They couldn't adapt because they didn't know what was changing. Their isolation guaranteed their destruction. Let me give you one of the most perfect historical examples of this principle: China during the Ming Dynasty. In the early 15th century, China was the most advanced civilization on Earth. They had massive fleets of ships that could have dominated global trade. They had technology superior to Europe. They had wealth and power. But then, the Ming emperors made a catastrophic decision. They decided to isolate China from the world. They banned overseas trade. They destroyed their naval fleets. They built walls, both literal and metaphorical, to protect Chinese civilization from foreign influence. And what happened? While China isolated itself, Europe was exploring, trading, learning, adapting. European nations were gathering information from around the world. They were adopting technologies from different cultures. They were building global networks. And over the next few centuries, Europe surpassed China technologically, economically, and militarily. China's isolation, which was meant to protect Chinese civilization, actually guaranteed its decline. By the time China realized its mistake and tried to re-engage with the world, it was too late. The damage was done. They had lost centuries of development because they thought walls would keep them safe. This same pattern has repeated throughout history. Japan isolated itself for over 200 years during the Edo period, and by the time they reopened to the world, they were technologically backward and vulnerable. The Soviet Union tried to isolate itself behind the Iron Curtain, and it eventually collapsed partly because it couldn't compete with the information and innovation flowing through open societies. North Korea has isolated itself so thoroughly that it's now one of the poorest and most vulnerable nations on Earth despite its military posturing. Isolation always leads to decline. Always. There are no exceptions to this rule. But what exactly is happening psychologically and strategically when someone isolates themselves? Why does the fortress always fail? To understand this, we need to explore the multiple mechanisms through which isolation destroys what it's meant to protect. The first mechanism is information deprivation. When you build walls around yourself, you cut yourself off from the flow of information that you need to understand your environment. You stop hearing warnings about threats. You stop learning about opportunities. You stop receiving feedback that could help you improve. You become blind to changes happening around you. And in a world that's constantly changing, blindness is fatal. Think about this in the context of a business. A company that isolates itself from customer feedback, from market trends, from competitor innovations, that company is building a fortress. They might feel protected from criticism and from the chaos of the market. But they're actually guaranteeing their obsolescence. They don't know what customers want. They don't see competitors coming. They don't adapt to new technologies. Their fortress of isolation becomes their tomb. Consider the case of Sears, once the most dominant retailer in America. For decades, they were the place where Americans shopped. They had everything. But as the retail landscape changed, as Walmart emerged with better logistics, as Amazon emerged with online shopping, Sears isolated itself in its traditional business model. They built a fortress around their existing stores and catalog business. They didn't engage deeply with the new realities of retail. They didn't gather the information they needed about changing consumer behavior. They didn't adapt. And their isolation from market realities destroyed them. By the time they realized they needed to change, it was too late. The fortress had made them blind, and blindness killed them. Compare that to a company like Microsoft. In the early 2000s, Microsoft was dominant but starting to become complacent. They had built a fortress around their Windows and Office businesses. They were missing the mobile revolution. They were missing the cloud revolution. But then leadership changed, and the new CEO, Satya Nadella, deliberately broke down the fortress. He opened Microsoft to partnerships they would have rejected before. He embraced platforms they would have competed against. He gathered information aggressively about where technology was heading. He stayed connected to developers, to customers, to trends. And this openness, this deliberate rejection of the fortress mentality, revitalized Microsoft. They became relevant again. They grew again. They thrived again. Not because of walls, but because of openness. The second mechanism through which isolation destroys you is ally deprivation. Humans are social animals. We evolved to survive in groups. Throughout our evolutionary history, the lone human was a dead human. We needed the tribe for protection, for resource sharing, for reproduction, for everything. And despite all our modern technology and independence, this fundamental truth hasn't changed. We still need allies. We still need networks. We still need people who will support us, warn us, help us, defend us. When you build a fortress and isolate yourself, you lose your allies. Relationships atrophy from neglect. Networks dissolve when you stop maintaining them. People forget about you when you're not present. And when crisis comes, when you desperately need help, there's nobody there. The fortress that was supposed to protect you has actually left you defensively exposed and alone. Think about this in the context of workplace dynamics. The employee who isolates themselves in their office or their cubicle, who doesn't build relationships with colleagues, who doesn't network, who doesn't maintain visibility with leadership, that employee is building a fortress. They might feel protected from office politics and interpersonal drama. But when layoffs come, when restructuring happens, when opportunities arise, they're vulnerable because they have no allies. Nobody knows them well enough to fight for them. Nobody thinks of them for opportunities. Nobody warns them about threats. Their isolation has made them expendable. I once knew a brilliant engineer who was phenomenally talented at his technical work. He could solve problems nobody else could solve. But he deliberately isolated himself. He didn't go to social events. He didn't build relationships with other departments. He didn't maintain visibility with leadership. He thought his technical excellence was enough. He thought the fortress of his competence would protect him. And for a while, it did. But when the company went through a major restructuring, he was one of the first people let go. Why? Because nobody fought for him. Nobody vouched for him. Nobody even thought about him because he had made himself invisible. His fortress of isolation had made him vulnerable, and when the threat came, he was defenseless. Compare that to another person I knew in the same company who was less technically brilliant but phenomenally well-connected. She knew people across every department. She maintained relationships with leadership. She was visible and engaged. When the same restructuring happened, multiple people fought to keep her. Multiple departments wanted her. Leadership valued her not just for her technical skills but for her ability to connect people and facilitate collaboration. Her network was her fortress, and it protected her when walls never could have. The third mechanism through which isolation destroys you is adaptability deprivation. When you build a fortress, you become static. You become rigid. You stop changing because you're not exposed to forces that would require change. You become brittle. And when the world changes around you, as it inevitably does, you cannot adapt. You break. Think about this principle in biological terms. Organisms that evolve in isolated environments, like islands, often become highly specialized to their specific environment. They're perfectly adapted to exactly the conditions they face. But this specialization makes them incredibly vulnerable to any change in those conditions. When a new predator arrives, when the climate shifts, when food sources change, these specialized organisms often go extinct because they cannot adapt. They're too specialized, too rigid, too isolated from the broader evolutionary pressures that would have kept them flexible. The same thing happens to humans and human organizations that isolate themselves. They become specialized to their fortress. They become perfectly adapted to their isolated conditions. But when the world outside changes, when they're forced to engage with new realities, they cannot adapt. They're too rigid. Too specialized. Too isolated from the forces that would have kept them flexible and capable of change. Consider the case of academic institutions that became too isolated from the broader world. Universities that focused entirely on theoretical knowledge while ignoring practical application. Academics who spoke only to other academics in specialized jargon that nobody else could understand. They built fortresses of ivory towers. They felt protected from the messiness of real-world problems. But their isolation made them irrelevant. Students stopped valuing purely theoretical education when they couldn't get jobs with it. Funding agencies stopped supporting research that had no practical application. Society stopped respecting academics who couldn't communicate or engage with real problems. The fortress of academic isolation, which was meant to protect pure knowledge, actually undermined the relevance and sustainability of academic institutions. Compare that to universities and researchers who stayed connected to the world. Who engaged with industry. Who communicated their findings to the public. Who tackled real-world problems. who maintain flexibility between theory and practice. These institutions and individuals thrived because their engagement with the world kept them adaptive, relevant, and valuable. Their openness was their protection. The fourth mechanism through which isolation destroys you is target creation. When you isolate yourself, when you become disconnected from the world around you, you actually make yourself more vulnerable to attack, not less. You become a clear target. You have no allies to defend you. You have no intelligence network to warn you. You have no relationships that make people hesitate to attack you. You're exposed precisely because you tried so hard to be protected. This is a principle that's been understood in military strategy for thousands of years. A fortress seems strong. It has thick walls. It's defensible. But it's also static. It can be surrounded. It can be starved. It can be bypassed. And the people inside the fortress are cut off from intelligence about what's happening outside. They don't know where the enemy is. They don't know what the enemy is planning. They don't know what's changing in the broader strategic situation. The walls that protect them also blind them to threats. Think about this in the context of geopolitics. Throughout history, nations that isolated themselves thinking it would keep them safe often found that isolation made them more vulnerable, not less. They didn't have allies to deter aggression. They didn't have intelligence networks to warn them of threats. They didn't have diplomatic relationships that could help them navigate crises. They were alone in a dangerous world, and their isolation made them attractive targets for expansion or exploitation. North Korea today is a perfect example. They've isolated themselves so thoroughly that they're now one of the most vulnerable nations on Earth. Yes, they have nuclear weapons, which provides some deterrence. But they have almost no allies. They have almost no international relationships. They have almost no trade. They have almost no information flow from the outside world. They're trapped in a fortress of their own making, and that fortress is slowly strangling them. They're vulnerable to famine. Vulnerable to economic collapse. Vulnerable to internal instability. Their isolation, which was meant to protect their regime, has actually created multiple vulnerabilities that could destroy them. Compare that to a country like Singapore. Tiny. No natural resources. Surrounded by much larger neighbors. But Singapore didn't build fortresses. They built connections. They made themselves indispensable to global trade. They built relationships with countries around the world. They stayed open to foreign investment, foreign talent, foreign ideas. And this openness, this engagement, this refusal to isolate, made them secure. They're protected by their connections, by their importance to the global system, by their networks. Their vulnerability on paper became strength in practice because they chose connection over fortress. Now let's bring this into modern contexts that affect your life directly. Think about your career. The person who isolates themselves in their specialty, who doesn't network, who doesn't stay connected to their industry, who doesn't build relationships beyond their immediate team, that person is building a fortress. They think they're protecting themselves by focusing purely on their work. They think that excellence in their specific role will be enough. They think they're avoiding the messiness of politics and networking. But they're actually making themselves incredibly vulnerable. They don't hear about opportunities before they're publicly posted. They don't get warned about organizational changes that might affect them. They don't have mentors who can guide them. They don't have sponsors who will advocate for them. They don't have a reputation beyond their immediate circle. When their role becomes obsolete, when their department gets restructured, when leadership changes, when economic downturns require layoffs, they're vulnerable because they're isolated. The fortress of focus on their immediate work has left them defensively exposed in the broader organizational and industry context. Compare that to the person who deliberately builds relationships across their organization and industry. Who networks not just for immediate benefit but to build genuine connections. Who shares knowledge and helps others. Who maintains visibility with leadership. Who stays informed about industry trends and organizational dynamics. That person has protection that the isolated specialist never has. They hear about opportunities early. They get warned about threats. They have people who will advocate for them. They have options if their current role disappears. Their network is their fortress, and it's far more protective than any amount of specialized expertise in isolation could ever be. Let's talk about relationships and social life, because this is where many people catastrophically violate Law 18 after being hurt. When someone experiences betrayal, heartbreak, or deep disappointment in relationships, their instinct is often to build walls. To protect their heart. To never be vulnerable again. To isolate themselves emotionally. They decide they're better off alone. They decide that independence is safer than connection. They build a fortress around their emotions and their life. And what happens? They become lonely. They become disconnected. They lose the emotional support that humans need to thrive. They miss out on love, on intimacy, on deep connection, on the richness that relationships bring to life. They're safe from heartbreak, but they're also safe from joy. Safe from betrayal, but also safe from trust. Safe from disappointment, but also safe from hope. The fortress protects them from pain, but it also protects them from everything that makes life worth living. There's extensive research in psychology and medicine showing that social isolation is literally deadly. People who are socially isolated have higher rates of heart disease, higher rates of depression, higher rates of cognitive decline, higher rates of early death. Social connection isn't just nice to have. It's a fundamental human need, as important as food or water. When you build a fortress that cuts you off from connection, you're slowly killing yourself from the inside. The walls that feel protective are actually suffocating you. I knew someone once who went through a devastating divorce. The betrayal was deep. The pain was immense. And their response was to build walls. They decided never to date again. Never to trust anyone again. Never to be vulnerable again. They isolated themselves emotionally. And for a few years, they felt protected. The walls kept out the pain. But over time, something happened. They became bitter. They became depressed. They lost their joy. They lost their capacity for connection. The walls that were supposed to protect them had actually imprisoned them. By the time they realized this and tried to open up again, they had forgotten how. The fortress had become their identity, and dismantling it was incredibly difficult. Compare that to another person I knew who also went through a devastating divorce. The pain was just as deep. But their response was different. They grieved. They processed. They learned from the experience. But they didn't build walls. They stayed open to connection. They continued to be vulnerable. They continued to trust, albeit more wisely. And within a few years, they had built a new life filled with meaningful relationships. They had found love again. They were happy again. Not because they were naive or because they hadn't been hurt, but because they understood that connection requires vulnerability, and that the risk of pain is worth it for the possibility of joy. Their openness was their protection, not from pain, but from the slow death of isolation. Let's explore the fortress of comfort and routine. Many people build their entire lives around predictable routines and familiar environments. They eat at the same restaurants. They take the same routes to work. They interact with the same people. They engage in the same activities. They avoid anything unfamiliar or challenging. This creates a fortress of comfort that feels safe and manageable. But it's actually making them incredibly fragile. When something disrupts their routine, they fall apart. When their environment changes, they can't adapt. When they're forced into unfamiliar situations, they're overwhelmed. They've become so specialized to their fortress of comfort that they've lost the ability to handle novelty, challenge, or change. And in a world that's constantly changing, this fragility is dangerous. Think about people whose entire identity and daily structure was built around their workplace. They went to the same office every day for decades. They had the same colleagues. The same routine. The same comfortable patterns. Then the pandemic happened. Suddenly they were working from home. Their fortress of workplace routine was shattered. And many of these people struggled intensely. They couldn't adapt. They couldn't create new structures. They couldn't handle the disruption because they had become so specialized to their fortress that they lost flexibility. Compare that to people who deliberately introduced variety and challenge into their lives even when they didn't have to. Who tried new things regularly. Who put themselves in unfamiliar situations. Who practiced adapting to change. When disruption came, they handled it much better. They were already practiced at adapting. They were already comfortable with discomfort. They were already flexible. Their exposure to variety and challenge had made them anti-fragile. They got stronger from stress rather than breaking under it. There's a concept in biology and systems theory called hormesis. It's the idea that exposure to low levels of stress actually makes systems stronger. Muscles grow stronger when stressed by exercise. Immune systems grow stronger when exposed to pathogens. Bones grow denser when stressed by impact. But this only works if you're exposed to stress. If you isolate yourself from all stress, if you build a fortress of total comfort, you become weak. You atrophy. You lose resilience. The protection destroys what it's meant to protect. This same principle applies to psychological and emotional resilience. If you isolate yourself from all challenge, all conflict, all difficulty, you become psychologically fragile. You can't handle stress. You can't handle disagreement. You can't handle setbacks. But if you regularly engage with moderate levels of challenge and discomfort, you build psychological resilience. You become stronger. More capable. More confident. The engagement with difficulty is what protects you, not the fortress of comfort. Now let's talk about the fortress of ideological purity in echo chambers. This is particularly relevant in the modern age of social media and polarized politics. Many people are building fortresses of ideological isolation. They only follow people who agree with them. They only read sources that confirm their existing beliefs. They only interact with people who share their political views. They block anyone who disagrees. They curate their information environment to be an echo chamber of validation. This feels good. It feels safe. It feels like they're protecting themselves from toxic viewpoints and misinformation. But they're actually making themselves incredibly vulnerable. They're cutting themselves off from reality. They're living in a bubble that doesn't reflect the actual world. They're unable to understand people who think differently. They're unable to predict outcomes because they don't understand what others believe and why. They're vulnerable to being shocked when elections don't go the way they expected, when policies they opposed have more support than they realized, when the world outside their bubble doesn't match their expectations. Think about the 2016 US election. Many people on the left were absolutely shocked when Trump won. They hadn't seen it coming. Why? Because they had isolated themselves in echo chambers where everyone agreed that Trump's victory was impossible. They had built fortresses of ideological purity where dissenting voices were blocked and alternative perspectives were dismissed. Their fortress had made them blind to reality. They were so protected from viewpoints they disagreed with that they couldn't see what was actually happening in the country. Their isolation guaranteed their shock and their inability to respond effectively. Compare that to people who deliberately exposed themselves to diverse perspectives. Who read sources across the political spectrum. Who engaged with people they disagreed with. Who tried to understand rather than just dismiss opposing viewpoints. These people were much less shocked by political outcomes because they understood the full landscape. They had better information. They could see trends that the isolated couldn't see. Their openness to uncomfortable perspectives was actually their protection against being blindsided by reality. This applies beyond politics. In any domain, if you isolate yourself in an echo chamber of people who think like you, you make yourself vulnerable to being wrong. You lose access to information that could correct your errors. You lose the ability to reality test your beliefs. You become increasingly disconnected from truth because you've built a fortress against anything that challenges your views. The scientific method itself is designed to prevent this kind of fortress building. Science works through peer review, through replication, Through debate and criticism. Scientists are supposed to actively seek out potential flaws in their own work. They're supposed to engage with critics. They're supposed to update their beliefs when evidence contradicts them. When scientists build fortresses around their pet theories and refuse to engage with contradictory evidence, science stops working. The fortress of certainty prevents the openness that's necessary for truth. Let's talk about the fortress of expertise and specialization in the modern economy. We're constantly told to specialize. To become experts in narrow domains. To go deep rather than broad. And there's genuine value in expertise. But taken to an extreme, it becomes a fortress that makes you vulnerable. Think about people whose entire career was built on a specific technology or methodology that became obsolete. COBOL programmers when that language became legacy. Factory workers when automation replaced their specific skills. Specialists in industries that disappeared or transformed. These people had deep expertise. But their expertise was so narrow, so specialized, that when their domain became obsolete, they had nothing else. They had built a fortress of specialized knowledge that became a prison when the world changed. Compare that to people who are thoughtful about their online presence. Who protect what truly matters while maintaining enough visibility to participate in modern professional and social life. Who use privacy tools where appropriate but don't hide completely. Who share enough to build relationships and reputation without oversharing. They're protected by intelligent boundaries rather than total fortress, and they're able to benefit from connection while managing risk. Let me share a final comprehensive historical example that brings all of these principles together. The Byzantine Empire, which we mentioned briefly earlier, deserves deeper exploration because it lasted for over 1,000 years, making it one of the longest-lived empires in history. How did they survive so long? Not by building fortresses and isolating themselves, though they did have excellent defensive walls. The Byzantine Empire survived through radical openness and adaptability. They maintained extensive trade networks that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa. They gathered intelligence from across the known world through diplomats, merchants, and spies. They adapted foreign technologies and tactics rather than dismissing them as inferior. They formed strategic alliances with various kingdoms and empires. They were flexible in their approach to governance and willing to change when circumstances demanded it. They welcomed foreign scholars and ideas to Constantinople. They were multilingual and multicultural in a way that seems modern. This openness, this engagement with the world, this refusal to isolate, was central to their longevity. They knew what was happening around them. They had allies who would warn them of threats. They could adapt to changing circumstances. They weren't rigid or isolated. They were dynamic and connected. But in the empire's final centuries, something changed. They became more insular. More focused on internal orthodoxy than external engagement. More rigid in their thinking. More isolated diplomatically. They built psychological and political fortresses of tradition and inflexibility. And these fortresses, more than military defeats, led to their eventual fall. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, it wasn't just because of Ottoman military power. It was because the Byzantine Empire had lost the openness and adaptability that had kept it alive for a millennium. They had built fortresses, and those fortresses had made them vulnerable to exactly what they feared. So where does this leave you? What do you do with this knowledge? How do you avoid building fortresses while still protecting yourself in a genuinely dangerous world? The answer is to understand that real protection comes from engagement, not isolation. From connection, not walls. From information, not ignorance. From flexibility, not rigidity. From networks, not fortresses. When you feel the urge to build walls, to isolate yourself, to protect yourself through withdrawal, recognize that urge for what it is, fear disguised as wisdom. Your instincts are trying to keep you safe by doing exactly the thing that will make you vulnerable. Instead, lean into connection even when it feels risky. Stay engaged with the world even when it feels overwhelming. Gather information even when it's uncomfortable. Maintain relationships even when they require effort. Stay adaptable even when it requires humility. Face the world rather than hiding from it. Here's how to practically implement Law 18 in your life. First, prioritize information flow above comfort. Actively seek out perspectives that challenge you. Read sources you disagree with. Listen to people who think differently. Expose yourself to ideas that make you uncomfortable. Information is protection, even when it's unpleasant. The discomfort of engaging with challenging perspectives is far less dangerous than the blindness that comes from echo chambers. Second, build and maintain networks. Invest time in relationships even when you're busy. Stay connected to people across different domains of your life. Help others so they'll help you. Be generous with your knowledge and connections. Your network is your fortress. The strength of your relationships will protect you far more than any walls ever could. Third, practice strategic vulnerability. Share your struggles with people you trust. Ask for help when you need it. Admit your mistakes. Show your humanity. This creates deeper connections that actually protect you. People support those who are genuine and vulnerable far more than those who pretend to have it all together behind fortress walls. Fourth, stay adaptable. Don't become so attached to specific methods, beliefs, or positions that you can't change when the world changes. Hold your views firmly while remaining open to new information. Build expertise while maintaining curiosity across domains. Specialize while also generalizing. Depth and breadth together protect you in ways that either alone cannot. Fifth, regularly expose yourself to novelty and challenge. Do things that make you uncomfortable. Go to unfamiliar places. Try new activities. Meet different kinds of people. This builds anti-fragility. You become stronger through exposure to controlled challenges. You practice adapting. You build confidence in your ability to handle the unexpected. Sixth, question your assumptions regularly. Don't let your beliefs become fortresses. Be willing to be wrong. Update your thinking when evidence changes. Intellectual humility is not weakness, it's strength. The ability to change your mind when warranted protects you from the rigidity that destroys those who build fortresses of certainty. Seventh, maintain permeable boundaries rather than impermeable walls. Have standards and limits, yes, but don't make yourself completely inaccessible or inflexible. Regulate what comes in and out rather than cutting off all flow. Boundaries allow you to engage selectively and sustainably. Walls prevent you from engaging at all. Think about the difference between a cell membrane and a brick wall. A cell membrane is a boundary. It's selective about what passes through. It maintains the integrity of the cell while allowing essential exchanges with the environment. This selectivity keeps the cell alive. A brick wall, on the other hand, allows nothing through. And nothing alive can survive behind a completely impermeable wall. You need exchange. You need flow. You need connection. Boundaries allow this. Fortresses prevent it. The wisdom is in calibration. You need enough structure to be effective and enough openness to stay connected and informed. You need enough protection to prevent constant crisis and enough vulnerability to allow growth and connection. You need enough focus to go deep and enough breadth to stay adaptable. The sweet spot is between chaos and isolation, between total openness and total fortress. Let's talk about what this looks like in specific contexts. In your career, this means being excellent at your core work while also building relationships, staying informed about your industry, maintaining visibility with leadership, and developing transferable skills. It means focusing on your responsibilities while also networking and learning beyond your immediate role. It means being reliable and specialized while also being flexible and broadly capable. In your relationships, this means being willing to be vulnerable and open while also having healthy boundaries. It means sharing yourself while protecting your core well-being. It means giving to others while not depleting yourself. It means trusting while not being naive. It means loving while maintaining your sense of self. The fortress says protect yourself by closing off completely. The wisdom says protect yourself by engaging thoughtfully. In your personal development, this means exposing yourself to challenges and discomfort while not overwhelming yourself. It means practicing adaptability while maintaining core stability. It means questioning your beliefs while having strong values. It means exploring new things while also going deep. It means being open to change while having continuity. The fortress says stick with what you know. The wisdom says keep growing while staying grounded. In your consumption of information and ideas, this means deliberately exposing yourself to diverse perspectives while also being discerning about quality and truth. It means reading widely while thinking critically. It means listening to people you disagree with while not being gullible. It means staying open to being wrong while having intellectual standards. The fortress says only engage with views you already agree with. The wisdom says engage with everything while filtering thoughtfully. Now let's address some common objections to Law 18. The first objection is, but some people and situations really are toxic and dangerous, don't I need to protect myself? Absolutely yes. Law 18 is not saying you should have no boundaries, no standards, no protection. It's saying that isolation and fortress building are the wrong kind of protection. The right kind of protection is intelligent boundaries, not impermeable walls. If someone is genuinely abusive, cut them off. But don't build walls around your entire heart that prevent all connection. If a situation is genuinely dangerous, remove yourself. But don't isolate yourself from all situations that involve any risk. If information is genuinely false or harmful, reject it. But don't close yourself off to all information that challenges your views. The key is discernment, not fortress building. Selectivity, not isolation. Think of your immune system. It doesn't work by building a fortress that prevents all exposure to pathogens. That would be impossible and would prevent you from living in the world. Instead, it works by being exposed to pathogens and learning to recognize and fight them. It's selective. It attacks real threats while allowing beneficial organisms. It adapts to new threats. It's a sophisticated system of engagement, not a simple wall. Your psychological and social protection should work the same way. Engage with the world. Learn to recognize real threats. Develop the capability to protect yourself while remaining connected and open. The second objection is, but I've been hurt before, how can I stay open without getting hurt again? This is a legitimate concern, and the answer is that you can't stay completely open without ever being hurt again. Hurt is part of life. Pain is part of connection. Risk is part of engagement. The question is whether you want to be safe from all pain while also being safe from all joy, or whether you want to live fully with both pain and joy as possibilities. The person who's been hurt and builds fortress walls might be safe from being hurt again in the same way. But they're paying an enormous price for that safety. They're lonely. They're disconnected. They're missing out on love, on friendship, on intimacy, on all the things that make life rich and meaningful. They're dying of safety. The fortress is slowly suffocating them. The alternative is to stay open while being wiser. To be vulnerable while being more discerning. To trust while being more careful about who you trust. To love while having better boundaries. To engage while protecting your core well-being. This doesn't guarantee you'll never be hurt. But it allows you to live fully rather than merely existing behind walls. Think about it this way, the person who's never been hurt is either incredibly lucky or incredibly isolated. Pain is part of being alive. The question is not whether you'll experience pain, but whether you'll let that pain close you off or whether you'll integrate it and remain open. The fortress promises safety from pain but delivers a life that's not worth living. The open posture accepts pain as part of life but allows for a life that's rich, connected, and meaningful. The third objection is, but staying open and connected requires so much energy and effort, isn't isolation more efficient? This is a seductive argument because isolation does seem easier in the short term. You don't have to deal with other people's needs and drama. You don't have to maintain relationships. You don't have to navigate social complexity. You can just focus on yourself and your work. But in the long term, isolation is far less efficient than connection. The energy you save by not maintaining relationships, you lose many times over when you need help and have no one to turn to. The effort you save by not networking, you lose when you miss opportunities that only come through connections. The simplicity you gain by isolating, you pay for with vulnerability when the world changes and you're not prepared because you weren't connected to information flows. Think about it in economic terms. Maintaining relationships and staying connected is an investment. It costs energy up front, but it pays enormous dividends over time. You have people who will help you. You have information that protects you. You have opportunities that come through your network. You have support when you struggle. The return on this investment is far greater than the upfront cost. Isolation might seem efficient, but it's actually incredibly costly. You're cutting yourself off from all the benefits that connection provides. You're making yourself vulnerable in ways that will cost you far more than the energy you saved. It's like refusing to do preventive maintenance on your car because it takes time and effort. In the short term, you save time. In the long term, you pay far more when major problems develop that could have been prevented. The fourth objection is, but I'm an introvert, I need time alone. Does that mean I'm building fortresses? No. Needing time alone for rest and recharge is not fortress building. Introversion is not isolation. The difference is between needing solitude to recharge so you can engage with the world, versus hiding in solitude to avoid engaging with the world. An introvert who spends time alone but maintains meaningful relationships, who stays connected to information and ideas, who engages with the world in ways that work for their energy level, that person is not violating Law 18. They're practicing intelligent self-care that allows them to engage sustainably. They're having alone time as a way to recharge their batteries so they can connect, not as a way to avoid connection. But an introvert who uses their introversion as an excuse to completely isolate, who cuts themselves off from relationships, who avoids all social engagement, who becomes a hermit, that person is building fortresses. They're using their personality type as justification for something that's actually harmful. True introversion is about how you recharge, not about whether you engage with the world. You can be introverted and still maintain meaningful relationships. You can be introverted and still network professionally. You can be introverted and still stay connected to information and ideas. You just do it in ways that work for your energy levels and preferences. You might prefer one-on-one conversations to large parties. You might prefer deep conversations to small talk. You might prefer written communication to phone calls. All of that is fine. What's not fine is using introversion as an excuse for total isolation. Now let's talk about how to recognize when you're building fortresses versus when you're having healthy boundaries. Here are some signs that you're building fortresses. You find yourself increasingly isolated and lonely. You've cut off multiple relationships in the name of protecting yourself. You avoid situations that make you uncomfortable even when they could be beneficial. You only consume information that confirms what you already believe. You've stopped learning and growing. You feel safe but also empty and disconnected. You're rigid in your thinking and unable to adapt to change. You have few or no people you can turn to for help. You feel like the world is threatening and everyone is out to get you. These are signs that your protection has become a fortress that's actually harming you. The walls that were supposed to keep you safe have become a prison. The isolation that was supposed to protect you is slowly destroying you. Compare that to signs of healthy boundaries. You have meaningful relationships with people you trust. You can say no to things that don't serve you without cutting yourself off completely. You're willing to be uncomfortable when growth requires it. You expose yourself to diverse perspectives while thinking critically. You're continuously learning and adapting. You feel both secure and connected. You're flexible in your thinking while having strong core values. You have people you can turn to when you need support. You see the world as complex and mixed rather than entirely threatening. These are signs that you're protected by intelligent engagement rather than isolated by fortress walls. You're in the world, connected to others, exposed to information, while also having boundaries that prevent you from being overwhelmed or exploited. This is the sweet spot. This is where safety and growth coexist. Let me share one more story that illustrates the principle perfectly. There was a wealthy man who became so paranoid about his safety that he built an incredible fortress mansion. High walls, security systems, guards. He isolated himself completely. He never went out. He had everything delivered. He cut himself off from the world. He thought he was protecting himself. But his isolation made him increasingly paranoid and unstable. He didn't know what was happening in the world. He couldn't trust anyone because he was so disconnected. He became depressed and anxious. His physical health declined from lack of activity and social connection. His mental health deteriorated from isolation. And ironically, his fortress made him more vulnerable, not less. He couldn't detect real threats because he was so isolated from information. He had no real allies because he had cut everyone off. Eventually, he was exploited by one of the few people he did let in, precisely because he was so isolated that he couldn't get perspective or advice from others. The fortress that was supposed to protect him had made him more vulnerable to the very thing he feared. His isolation was the source of his downfall, not his protection from it. Now contrast that with another wealthy person who stayed engaged with the world despite having legitimate security concerns. They maintained relationships. They stayed informed. They engaged with their community. They had trusted advisors and genuine friends. They traveled and experienced life. Yes, they had reasonable security measures. But they didn't build a fortress. They stayed connected. And because of their connection, they actually were more secure. They had people who genuinely cared about them and would warn them of threats. They had information about real risks. They had perspective from diverse sources. They had a life worth living. Their engagement with the world, rather than isolation from it, was what actually protected them. So here's the ultimate truth of Law 18, the fortress is a trap. It promises safety but delivers vulnerability. It promises protection but delivers exposure. It promises security but delivers risk. The walls you build to keep danger out also keep life out. And a life lived behind walls is not a life worth protecting. Real security comes from engagement. From connection. From information. From relationships. From adaptability. From being in the world rather than hiding from it. This feels counterintuitive because it feels vulnerable. But vulnerability that's engaged with the world is actually safer than invulnerability that's isolated from it. Think about the fundamental paradox: the fortress feels strong because it's solid and unchanging. But in a changing world, solid and unchanging means brittle and breakable. The open posture feels weak because it's flexible and permeable. But in a changing world, flexible and permeable means adaptable and resilient. Strength and weakness are not what they seem. The apparent strength of the fortress is actual weakness. The apparent weakness of openness is actual strength. This is why Law 18 is so important and so often violated. Our instincts tell us to build walls when threatened. Our fear tells us to isolate when hurt. Our pride tells us to close off when challenged. But these instincts are wrong. They're leading us toward the very destruction we're trying to avoid. The wisdom is in recognizing this and choosing the counterintuitive path of engagement over isolation. So I'll leave you with these final questions to reflect on deeply. What fortresses have you built in your life? Where have you isolated yourself in the name of protection? What walls are you hiding behind? What information are you cutting yourself off from? What connections have you severed? What challenges are you avoiding? What parts of yourself have you closed off? What aspects of the world are you refusing to engage with? And what would happen if you dismantled those fortresses? What would happen if you opened yourself to information you've been avoiding? What would happen if you rebuilt connections you've severed? What would happen if you faced challenges rather than hiding from them? What would happen if you allowed yourself to be vulnerable in service of genuine connection? What would happen if you replaced your walls with networks, your isolation with engagement, your fortress with flexibility? Would you be less safe? Or would you actually be more secure through connection than you ever were through isolation? Would you be more vulnerable? Or would you actually be more resilient through adaptability than you ever were through rigidity? Would you be weaker? Or would you actually be stronger through the support of genuine relationships than you ever were alone behind walls? The fortress feels safe, but it's a tomb. The open field feels dangerous, but it's alive with possibility. This is Law 18. Do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous. The walls you build to keep the world out will trap you in. The protection you seek through isolation will become your destruction. Stay connected. Stay informed. Stay engaged. Stay open. Maintain boundaries, yes, but not fortresses. Have standards, yes, but not walls. Protect yourself, yes, but not through isolation. Your vulnerability is your strength. Your flexibility is your fortress. Your networks are your walls. And your willingness to engage with the dangerous, unpredictable, challenging world is ultimately what keeps you safe, powerful, alive, and thriving. The choice is yours. Build walls and slowly suffocate behind them, blind to the world, alone in your fortress, safe from everything including life itself. Or stay open to the world with all its dangers and possibilities, connected to others, informed by diverse sources, adaptable to change, resilient through engagement, and alive in the fullest sense. One path leads to the slow death of isolation disguised as safety. The other leads to the full life of engagement that includes risk but also includes everything that makes existence worthwhile. One path promises protection but delivers vulnerability. The other accepts vulnerability but delivers true protection through connection and adaptability. Choose engagement over isolation. Choose connection over walls. Choose flexibility over fortresses. Choose life over safety. Because the greatest danger is not in being vulnerable to the world, but in isolating yourself from it. The fortress destroys what it protects. The open hand receives what walls can never hold. This is the wisdom of Law 18. This is the path to enduring power and genuine security. Not through fortresses, but through connection. Not through isolation, but through engagement. Not through walls, but through the courage to remain open to life in all its danger and beauty.